AI is going to come and take away my job. Okay, so if it doesn't come to me, it's going to come and take away my job. So that is very scary for a lot of people.
Long before ChatGPT was a household name, our guest was already deep in the AI space, helping brands understand and harness this technology. AI is reshaping the way brands are building their businesses, structuring their teams, and connecting with their consumers. But there is a lot of noise and misconceptions out there. So in today's episode, we're going to aim to cut through all that noise. So without further ado, let me welcome our guest, Kevin Pereira, who is a managing director at Blue Artificial Intelligence and adjunct professor at HKU and HKUST. Welcome, Kevin. Great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So let's jump straight into it. So I've known you for many, many years. And even before I knew what artificial intelligence was, you were already in the field. So what first drew you into artificial intelligence space?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I actually started my career in finance. So I was a finance guy before. I was doing private banking with Citi in New York. And then at a certain point, you know, I wanted to just to change the career because I felt that I wasn't, you know, really finding something that I was excited about, right? And I think finance is a very comfortable career. There's a lot of positives about it, but I was just looking for something a little bit different. And so I ended up coming to Singapore. I went to INSEAD for my MBA and used that to transition into technology. And so my first job post INSEAD was actually working at a startup in Myanmar that was doing internet infrastructure. So we were putting fiber optic in the ground, cell towers, data centers, really building the infrastructure part of any technology solution. And I think for me, one of the learnings from that was to see the impact of technology on people, right? Because you go to a place like Myanmar, which, and I was there during 2015, 2016. So at the time, there wasn't really that much there. So when you start to put in technology, you see the impact on people's lives. It really, puts some tangible value on the things that you're doing. And so after that experience, I knew that's the area I wanted to be in. But Myanmar is also a difficult place to live. It sort of breaks my heart what's happening there now. But in terms of the time when I was there, it was exciting, but also in terms of infrastructure, it was quite weak. So you'd have maybe 1 or 2 days without power. And I think when you're a tourist and you light a candle, it's cute, right? But when you're actually there and your laptop doesn't work, your phone doesn't charge, it can be a little bit frustrating. So I ended up coming back to Hong Kong, and there I met an alumni from my school who had been working in AI for about 10 years at that point. So he opened his own consulting firm, Blue Artificial Intelligence, asked me to join, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Wow. So your classmate was already working in that space for 10 years.
Yes.
Even. So that was since 2005.
Yeah. So he had graduated, I'm sure he won't want me to give the exact date, but in the early 2000s, let's say. And then I had graduated sort of in the mid 2010s. So there's a gap, a bit of a gap between us, but he had been in the space for a long time. So probably one of the OGs of, AI. And then when I finished up Myanmar, we met at a conference in Singapore. And then he said, hey, would you be interested in artificial intelligence? And I mentioned to him, I don't know too much about it at the time, but I'm willing to learn. And he said, you know what, that's what I'm looking for. And so I think that was really the sort of combination that led to the start of Blue and, the last sort of almost 10 years now.
Wow. And so how has the AI space changed really from when you joined Blue to what it is now? Because now it's obviously so mainstream and it's, finally reached the final level of consumers.
Yeah. So I think, we always knew that AI would take off. I mean, when you think about the practical business applications, there was a lot there, but the real question for us was adoption, right? And I think whenever you have new technology, there's always certain adoption triggers that you tend to see. And so I think, if I kind of think about consumers and where we saw the explosion of AI, the release of ChatGPT, I think really changed the game. And I think one of the big reasons for that is it actually made accessibility a lot easier. So before, AI was always thought to be something that people who could program or very kind of a select group could only use. And then when ChatGPT drops, overnight, you, me, grandma can all start to use ChatGPT, right? And I think that changes the game quite a bit. And I think in addition to that, that one game-changing sort of technology application was also applicable to many different industries simultaneously. Typically, when you have these types of sort of drops of new products, it's only a niche or maybe a slightly wide niche. But this is literally, finance people can use it, HR people can use it, whichever function at a company you're at. If you're a podcaster, you want to build more content, that's also possible as well. So I think because of the applicability and the accessibility, I think that's when we saw a really big jump in kind of AI usage and then it becoming more mainstream as well.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely one of those, adopters of AI because
Mhm.
I always knew that, oh, AI, it's going to be this big disruptor, but I'm not an engineer, like I come from marketing and an investment background. I don't really know how it would work. And then
Mhm.
same exactly what you described, like ChatGPT came out and I tried it out and I thought, ooh, this can be a game changer for me in the volume of content I can produce because now all of a sudden, I can use it to like amplify a lot of things
Mhm.
and a lot of the manual labor is taken out of the equation.
Yeah.
Has it surprised you how fast it spread with the release of ChatGPT, or was it kind of something that you anticipated?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Because I think when we think about AI development, it tends to follow a typically exponential path, meaning that at the beginning, the improvements are very slow. And then it hits this sort of kink where the exponential sort of piece kicks in. And then the improvement gets very rapid over a very short space of time, right? So I think it's always hard to judge when the kink's going to come. But I think we had seen a few early versions of ChatGPT, right? And I remember even teaching it or talking about it to my students when I in the university course that I was doing. And if you look at the early versions, right, and you look at the output, like I feel like you wouldn't even use it to send a Christmas card to your dog, right? It's really nonsensical. The grammar's off, the meaning is off. But at the time, if I looked at where it was, and then I thought about that exponential kind of improvement, I was even mentioning to the students, at some point, if this really goes the way I think it might, then you might be using it day to day in your job for your homework, which is another actually interesting topic to talk about. But nevertheless, the applications are really wide. But I think when you discuss this with students at an early phase, I think then they and you start to think about where it's going to go, right? So was it surprising that in terms of where it is in terms of the final output? Probably not. But I think maybe the thing that surprised me was the speed at which it was developed. We knew it was coming. It was just a question of when. And I think the when part surprised me.
And in terms of the when bit, so when DeepSeek came out,
Mm.
again, for someone who isn't in the AI space, it was a bit of a shocker. Like, oh my God, like how is this possible? Something, as powerful as ChatGPT came out, and reportedly it costs so much less. Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think when we start to see improvements in AI, right, it can come from many different sources. So before DeepSeek, a lot of the improvements were coming about because big companies were putting more resources, meaning they had better chips in terms of processing. They might have had just more money to burn in terms of electricity and, really getting the model better from a resource perspective. Now, the interesting thing with DeepSeek is because they were constrained on the resource side, they had to think about where else can they squeeze out better performance, right? And so for them, they didn't really think about it from a resources perspective. They looked at the model architecture, right? So, if I take it from the super technical white paper that they have and bring it down into kind of terms that I think might be applicable for your audience, one of the innovations they came up with was something called mixture of experts. Okay, so if I think about an analogy, and I will confess that this is not my analogy, I read this somewhere, but I thought it was very good in terms of explaining, is to think about a mixture of experts like two hospitals. Okay. And on one side, you have what we call the closed source tools like ChatGPT. And closed source means that you can't really go in and change too much. Okay. So if first we talk about closed source and open source, so closed source is basically a car where you sit in, it drives you to your destination, and that's it. You can't open the hood. You can't change anything in the engine. Nothing is, customizable. Okay. Then on the other side, you have open source. And the open source car is effectively one where you can open it up. You can look at kind of what the engine looks like. You can also change things in the engine. Okay. So that's the open source versus closed source. So open source is the tools we traditionally thought about, which things like ChatGPT. And then open source was this idea with DeepSeek. Initially, Meta had released something called Llama, which was the first real open source model, but it wasn't that good, right? So no one really thought about it as a viable option. So the DeepSeek kind of craze earlier this year was really more about a open source model that is actually comparable, right? And that's what got everybody excited. Now, in terms of that model architecture idea, if we think about why they were able to do it, in one sense, you have the, let's call it the open source hospital and the closed source hospital. Okay. And the mixture of experts idea is basically that when you go to a closed source hospital, the way it would work there is you go in, you say, I'm sick, and they say, okay, go see every doctor we have. Okay, so let's say there's 100 doctors in the hospital. You go see every doctor. And then what typically happens is the chance of your diagnosis being right is very high. Okay, but the resources spent is very high as well, right? Because you have to go see every doctor. Now, in the open source model, what happens is you go again to the hospital, but instead of just going there and seeing every doctor, there's a very smart receptionist when you first get there. They ask you what's wrong. And then based on what you say, they say, okay, go see these 4 doctors. Okay. So that means that there's a chance your diagnosis might be wrong, but in terms of resources we use to do your diagnosis, it's exponentially less. And that's really the difference between, let's say, a DeepSeek model on the open source side versus a closed source model. So in terms of resources, exponentially less, but in terms of the kind of accuracy, somewhat comparable. And that's the bit that got people really excited.
But do you think that it's eventually going to get, in terms of the output, like as good as ChatGPT?
So I think when you talk about output, right, it kind of depends what you're defining as your final performance, right? So in the industry, there are some benchmark tests. So basically, think like multiple choice questions that they give, and sometimes they see how many of those multiple choice questions did I get right. Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it also is what is the implications with data and what actually comes about because of that, right? So if we think about the closed source models, many companies initially were very reluctant to have their employees use these tools because the idea or the fear they had was if you put proprietary data into these tools, the vendors get it. And so if you had any confidential data, they're very worried that those companies are going to be able to access that, right? So initially they said, absolutely no employees of ours should use this stuff because of the data privacy issues. The difference with open source is once the model is available, one of the ways to use it is to download it directly onto your hardware and then use it there as well, right? So when we talk about performance and considerations, it's not only like how well does a model do in terms of output, there's a whole other host of criteria that are important, right? So when I think businesses think about this, it's not only a performance question, it is also what is the data security part? What is the privacy components, right? And I think though all of those filter in. So I think when you talk about performance, I agree with you, it's part of it, but there's also a bunch of other considerations. So if founders, if company owners are thinking about what tools to use, I would advise them don't only think about the output and the final performance, think about what are all these other pieces that are there too in terms of privacy and data that might be important to them. Because these decisions of what tools to use should be a trade-off between a bunch of different things, as opposed to, hey, it just makes really good content, right?
So, staying on the topic of business applications, what, in your opinion, is the state of AI adoption into businesses today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it varies a little bit by industry, and it varies also a lot by company as well, right? I think kind of on a high level, whenever I think about AI, the way I define it to students and also kind of business folks is that AI is simply a tool to achieve an objective, right? And so, therefore, if you think about it that way, it's a lot less scary for people, which I think is good. And also, it forces you to think about what is the objective you're using it for, right? And so, if we kind of consider those two things, then I think the important part becomes which industries have identified places to use AI in the right way. Okay. And I would say that it's pretty mixed. Different industries have different sort of views on it. I'd say industries that have very sensitive data are a little bit reluctant for obvious reasons, right? If we think about healthcare, for example, there's very sensitive data. If we think about financial services, that also has very sensitive data. So I think they are a little bit more reluctant, right? I think there's other industries though that are maybe on the more traditional side that have a lot of opportunity. Right? I think that's the interesting part. So over at Blue, we have a few industries we deal a lot with. Ironically, financial services and healthcare are one of them, but they are under a lot of restrictions. I do think we also see interest from retail, energy, and manufacturing, right? And I think those are areas where they're a little bit more open, right? So especially with manufacturing, things like quality assurance, things like designing new products. I think they're very open to using that there too. So I think it really does come down to the company, the culture, and what they're trying to do there. I'd say another important part for using AI is also having data as well, right? So those five sort of industries I mentioned are somewhat traditional industries, but they do collect a lot of data, and that's the opportunity. So within financial services, if I just hone in on one, if we think about insurance, insurance actually collects a lot of data about people to make decisions. But I would also argue to you that they probably don't use all the data they have to maximize the value. So I think part of the kind of question onto where the adoption is and who's using it, I think really comes down to the company, comes down to the industry, and a lot of that is related to the data part of it because that's the fuel that really powers AI.
Yeah, and I can imagine in retail as well,
Mhm,
because my first job was actually I was in retail
mhm,
for Christian Dior, but it was still like traditional retail, and we collected a lot of data on our clients, but it would be in a physical book. You had
mhm.
handwrite notes,
Yep.
and like some of it would put into like like the main CRM system,
Mhm.
but like a lot of like SA sales, it would just keep it in their physical little
Yep.
book,
Mhm.
and then you can imagine obviously that like things slip through the cracks. So I
Yeah.
think they're an application of something like getting AI to actually process all that data could give you smarter decisions, maybe even in merchandising and
Mhm,
something saying, oh, like for example, it's funny enough. In my second job at Christian Dior,
mhm,
I moved into sort of more of a back of house operations
mhm,
on the customer relationship management. And one of my tasks was to go through all of the sales data for all of the customers and then try and see patterns.
mhm, mhm.
And I mean, I was doing it very manually on Excel.
Yeah.
Like you can imagine, it was like 2011,
Mhm,
and yeah, basically then I found like, all right, then like customers from Brazil typically come during these months, and
yeah.
they typically shop for this type of inventory, or like, oh, they prefer these colors, they prefer this,
Yep.
and you find these patterns, you run them through your colleagues, you say, oh, like you guys are on the floor, is it actually matches what? And they're like, oh, actually that's true.
Mm.
So then that allowed us to put requests for the correct inventory with the HQ and saying, all right, like we want more pink handbags of this size,
Mhm.
versus this, otherwise they would send us more maybe nude colors or different colors. So I think it's a very rudimentary application of something like that, but now they could do it at such wider scale, not just one person trying to do it on Excel, but actually have it be scalable.
Yeah, and if I add maybe a little bit onto that, right? If we think about one of the areas of AI that I'm very excited about, it's this area of what we call unsupervised learning, right? So the idea behind unsupervised learning is that you give the AI a ton of data and you ask it to come up with the insights, okay? Meaning that you don't define the output, right? So you basically say, hey, here's a ton of data, find me the interesting patterns and come back to me, right? And what I think is important there is that it looks for what we call correlation. Okay, so not to make this a math lecture, but correlation is basically as variable A goes up, variable B goes down, right? So you just look at how do things move in relation to each other. Now, I think once the AI identifies the correlations there, they then act, or often what happens is they give it to a human being to establish causation, right? Does variable A cause the drop in variable B? So in some ways, what you're talking about is identifying correlation on one side and then checking with your product specialist, is there causation there? Right? And I think that's the correct way to do it. It's just that AI can look at so much more data than you can, right? Not to say that you are, not great or anything like that, but it is just a function of the AI itself, right? So in the same space of time, it can look at so much more data than you can, identify a ton of correlations, but then we do need the human beings to come in and double check that and make sure that there is some causation there. Okay, because two things could move, but if they're not related, then even if you change one, it's not going to affect the other, right? So therefore, I think with unsupervised learning in the projects we've worked on, what we often find is there are correlations it brings up that the humans have never thought about. That for me is the interesting part, right? Because if it's stuff you already know about, no big deal, right? But if it's relationships you never considered, but then when you really think about it, there is a causal relationship. I think that's where AI brings in some amazing innovations going forward.
Oh, it's very, very interesting. Kind of building on that a little bit, what are some of the trends you think founders should really pay attention to in AI, and what trends they should ignore as noise?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? And I think with trends, one of the things I've realized working in AI for a while is every time I try to predict where AI is going, I'm always wrong. Okay. So I think it's important, therefore, not so much to be disillusioned or hyped up by the tools that are there, but think about your process properly. Okay, so for founders, my suggestion is think about the entire process that you have. Okay. And in this process, there can be some bits that are repetitive, boring, stuff that's not fun for human beings. I think that's one aspect of it. And secondly, you should also think about where are your bottlenecks, right? Because fundamentally, in your process, if one part is really a massive bottleneck, even if you apply AI elsewhere to improve, it's not going to improve the output of the system because that bottleneck is still the problem, right? So, one of the ways when we go through our process of identifying where you can use AI, we look at the entire process, we break it up, and then we see where's the bottleneck and see if AI can be put in there so that it improves the scale. And secondly, let's also look for repetitive routine things that your staff or your people may not enjoy doing, right? Because part of the challenge for founders and organizations is in the future, how do they take their talent and integrate it well with AI? And I think if you can take the boring stuff away from someone's job and allow them to do the more fun parts of it, I think they will enjoy the job more, and you will also see greater increases in productivity. So those would be my sort of rough, kind of high level tips to think about what to do. And I think then the next question is going to be which tools you use, right? And I think the tool question is an interesting one because before we only had a few tools, right? So it wasn't really that much of a choice. I think going forward, one of the skills is going to be for a certain use case or business problem, how do you pick the right tool? And I think from an education perspective, getting used to the tools, playing around with those will actually help inform your decision on that. So even in the classes that I'm teaching, I'm not trying to show the kids how or how many tools are out there, and also how can you gain experience with many different tools and then find the right one for the thing that you're trying to do. I think that's a really important skill going forward.
So let's pause here for a second. Can you name drop a few of your favorite tools that you think founders or brand builders are sleeping on something beyond ChatGPT?
Sure. So I guess if it comes down to content creation, right? The way I see generative AI kind of creating content is in probably four main forms. It's kind of text, which is probably what we're familiar with, but I think that we've also got pictures, video, and sound as well, right? So I think in this space, the LLMs, the large language models, typically create text, right? I think there's quite a few of them out there. But what I like often, especially when it comes to education, is actually looking at platforms that allow you to have access to many different tools. So, one of the things that was being used in a lot of Hong Kong universities at the beginning was something called POE, which stands for Platform for Open Exploration. It's available at poe.com, but you can also get the app version for it. And the good thing about POE is within the application, you can actually pick many different large language models, many different image generators, right? So you have access to many tools in one place.
Oh.
And what happens is typically if a new tool drops and it's quite widely used, in a few weeks it's added to their kind of list as well. Right. So that's helpful because then you have one platform where you can access many different tools. And I think there's many of these types of platforms out there. So POE is just one of them. But I think the platforms are good because if you subscribe to individual tools, then you may not necessarily have access to newer tools from other vendors. At least this way, you kind of catch as many of them as you can. And what I also like about some of these platforms is it allows you to compare the output, meaning you put in a prompt for, let's say, large language model A, and then at the bottom it says compare to large language model B. So you just hit one button, puts that same prompt into the next large language model, and you start to compare. And I think what that does effectively is it makes you or gives you an intuitive sense of what can these different tools do, and then you can start to become good at the tool selection part I was talking about before, right? So then you develop an intuitive sense as to what tool to use for which situation. So I think on the large language model and image side, I think POE does a good job of that, right? In terms of pure image tools, I use Midjourney quite a lot. I think Midjourney is pretty realistic in terms of the output, and also the edits that you can generally do are quite good. So Midjourney's kind of been a tool of choice for a while. So I like them there. And then maybe on the side of sound, right? There's a company out there called ElevenLabs, and ElevenLabs have been used quite a bit, where you can put in text and then it actually converts that into a sound file, right? And I think the voice profiles that they have are not just your boring robotic ones that are monotone all the time, but there's a lot of expression there, right? And even if you put punctuation in your text, that's reflected in the voice too. So I think ElevenLabs is also a good one to start. So what I would say is, these are good starting points for tools, but I think within this space, it's going to get crowded very quickly. So again, knowing which tool to use for which situation can be helpful on the content creation side.
And what are some of the mistakes do you think founders make most commonly when they start implementing AI tools?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There's a couple of areas, right? I'd say one of the big ones is over reliance, right? Because I think with these tools, they're getting to the point where they're very easy to use. When something's very easy to use, you tend to get a little bit lazy, right? And that's not founders, that's everybody, me included as well. And I
Human
especially see
nature.
this from students, right? Because students always want to find the most efficient way to do things. Some people can call that lazy. It depends, I think, on which side of the table you're sitting on. And to share an example, right, which I think is actually quite funny. So recently, I gave my students a task to do, and they had to use a large language model and then send me the output in an email. And Anya, like four of them, all right, actually sent me the email back, and the first line of the email reads, "Dear," in brackets, professor's name. I'm like, come on, like, that's almost unforgivable.
Yeah.
I think in the body of the text, if you make a mistake, I can kind of maybe forgive that. But the first line, if it's dear professor's name, that's a problem, right? And again, it's not that my ego is hurt, but I think if they go out into the world of work and they send an email to a client, and in that for that client, if it says dear in brackets client's name, that does not go down well, right? So I think one of the risks here for sure is the over reliance on the technology and not using your kind of common sense to double check. So, something I would tell not only founders, but just people across the board, be skeptical. These things make mistakes. They often do something called hallucinations, which is where they make up stuff, right? So, to just copy and paste your homework, to just copy and paste content, and make it happen there is very, very dangerous. So, please, please, please double check all the output. It's really, really important. Okay, so over reliance, definitely one piece of it. I think something else that founders should keep in mind is for a lot of the tools out there, especially the free versions of these tools, very few folks read the terms and conditions, right? Now, for a lot of the free versions of the tools, basically what you're doing is you're saying, in exchange for the output that I get for free, you can take my data, right? And this is something that a lot of people don't appreciate. Like sometimes when I tell folks that, if you use Poe, it's a great tool, but keep in mind that you're probably giving a lot of the vendors your data, they get a lot of nervous looks. And so I worry what they've put into these tools. But in effect, many cases they have your data there. You want to be again very mindful of what data you're providing. And if you think it's confidential or if it's kind of, something you don't want the world to know about, think twice before you allow access for these tools, to that data. I think that's really important. Let's say number one, over reliance. Number two, data. And I think number three is to really use the tools in a judicious way. And what I mean by this is that some of these tools work by how much content they produce and how much content you input as well. And because these tools are so easy to use, it's very easy to just start to use it a lot and see the costs add up very, very quickly. So, just keep in mind, like, what is the objective you have? So I said AI is a tool to achieve an objective. So think about the objective, be precise about that objective, and use that to guide your usage as well. I think if you do that, then genuinely, I think you'll find the cost won't be too crazy. But in general, what I'm seeing on the cost side also, though, is as the tools become more plentiful, costs are also coming down. So that's probably a less of an issue. But if founders are, cash strapped, if they've got a smaller kind of operation, they may want to be cognizant of the cost piece as well.
Wow, lots to think about.
Sure.
So you mentioned a few things like over reliance or feeding AI too much data that might be sensitive, that you might not be, aware that you're actually sharing, which I think creates a lot of fear around AI, a lot of misunderstanding. And I know in your line of work with Blue, you do a lot of education on it. So what's sort of your take on the sort of fear mongering around artificial intelligence?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? So I think when I think of fear regards to I probably think of fear coming from two main sources. Source number one is probably Hollywood, right? So if you think about any movies with AI in it, right? Generally does not end up too well for the human beings, right? We think of Terminator, Megan, even the most recent Mission Impossible movie where the enemy is an AI. it's always negative generally, right? And so I think when people see movies like this for 15, 20, 25 years, the negative associations get solidified in their head, right? So I think that's one sort of area. And the general theme there is AI is going to come and kill us, right?
Yeah.
Black Mirror, I mean, I can keep on naming a bunch of different movies and TV shows, but that's the general sentiment that a lot of people have. And I think the second source of fear for a lot of people is that AI is going to come and take away my job. Okay, so if it doesn't come kill me, it's going to come and take away my job. So that is very scary for a lot of people. And I think when we at Blue started, right, we were thinking there's the education part of AI and then there's the implementation part of AI. And we thought at the beginning it would be 80% implementation and 20% education. And we found very quickly it's flipped the other way around. And I think a big reason for that is the education is one of the best ways to address the fear, right? Because if you really know what AI can do, and more importantly, you know what AI cannot do, then you will tend to feel a bit more comfortable from a, hey, it's not going to come kill me, at least not tomorrow. And secondly, if I know what the capabilities are, I can think about how in my future career I can combine both myself and the AI to come up with the most productive version of me, right? So I think the fear is definitely there. There's many sources, but I think education for me is one of the ways we really address that fear and just calm a lot of people down. And I think that's what a lot of people need because when you really don't know something, you tend to be uncertain and you'll tend to default to a very negative view of it, right? So I think education is one really good way to combat the fear.
And building on the future of teams and future of work, I know you do a lot of lectures and workshops about how AI is going to impact the future of work. So how do you think AI is now changing the way teams are structured, and how can founders of, brands that maybe don't have a lot of resources and they're thinking, how do I structure my team going forward? What sort of advice do you have for them?
Sure. So the way I would think about jobs going forward, right? And I'll provide a framework here. So I think it's not so much about job automation going forward, it's more about task automation. So what I mean by that is every job consists of certain tasks. Some of them are easy to automate, some of them are hard to automate. And I think what's going to happen in the future is the AI comes in and takes away the easy to automate stuff, leaving us, being humans, with the hard to automate stuff. So I think then if you think about jobs and roles, right, it's going to start to become quite clear which tasks are going. And therefore, these jobs, which might have the same title in the future, I think the tasks that they have will be very different, right? So if I think about buckets of tasks that are hard to automate, I think one of those buckets is human to human interaction, right? So I think a lot of roles that have human to human interaction components, you'll probably still need human beings to be there, right? But in terms of the support for those roles, that can often shift to an AI, right? So let's take real quick, like a podcaster like yourself, right? If you're thinking about how to create content in terms of what am I going to say, what questions am I going to talk about, that is something that AI can give you at least a head start on. And my suggestion would be you ask the AI, what are questions I could ask Kevin? This is his background. And then when you get the list, you curate the list, A, for which questions to ask, but B, also to ask also how to ask those questions in your own style, right? Because again, the generic question that it comes up with might be a good question, but may not fit your podcasting theme, your style, the way you deliver stuff, right? So you add your secret sauce on top of that. So I think when it comes to that collaboration between humans and AI, we just have to think about how are we going to get those easy to automate things out, and then how do we integrate that with the humans today. And I think initially they'll probably be a little bit uncomfortable for some people because they might be doing the same task for the last 20, 30, 40 years, right? So to give it up straight away, it's going to be a little bit difficult. So I think there's going to be some discomfort in that process. But I think what I find for the most part is those things that are easy to automate tend to be repetitive, boring, and just painful overall, right? And I think if you truly get them out, people will be freed, right? Like if I think also about my old job as a private banker before my life in AI, I enjoyed it because I could go out and meet people. I found the admin stuff and the paperwork to be frustrating, right? So I've also done recently some sessions on AI for private bankers. When I tell them about a potential world where, Anya, they don't have to do the paperwork, I almost see them start to tear up, right? But it's not tears of sadness. It's like tears of joy. It's like, oh my God, I could get rid of this stuff, this would be fantastic. Right. So I think when it comes to jobs and how founders think about it, that integration for their teams going forward is going to be AI with the human beings. And we're going to have to start to think about how that's going to work. Now, if I stood here and said that no jobs are going to be affected, though, I'd be being disingenuous, right? But the way we should think about those jobs being affected is what percentage of the tasks could be automated. And if that percentage is very high, then that job is at risk. Right? So I think that's the way people should think about their jobs. And also founders should think about what are the roles I want to have in the future. Because I think one of the interesting pieces that we've not really talked about is in addition to jobs evolving, I also think when new technology comes into place, you'll also create new jobs that never existed before. Right? And this is interesting for founders too, because what are those new roles that we haven't had before? But now, because we're going to use AI, what should we now put into place? Right. So those are also, I think, another area of the sort of new teams of the future that is going to matter as well.
Oh, so let's actually dig into that a bit further. What are some of the roles that you think are going to be relevant in the future that don't exist now because AI is getting so closely integrated into the business processes?
Yeah. So we get this question a lot from companies, right? And I think it's interesting because they don't know what they're looking for, but they're like, we want to hire for a role that we don't know about.
Yeah.
So if I think about what are some of the general themes, right, that are coming, I think one of them is this role of what I'd like to vaguely call an AI ethicist. And I've actually seen this pop up in a couple of job descriptions. But the idea behind the AI ethicist is someone who's in charge of the question where we consider what's the right way to use AI, but not from a technology standpoint, more from the perspective of the impact on stakeholders. Right. So, what's the effect of this AI going to be on my customers, on my employees, on my wider community? Right. And I think that AI ethicist person does not necessarily need a tech background. It's more about let's even say a philosophy background, for example, because in philosophy, you consider what are the moral frameworks of right and wrong, right? You have these sort of, other frames of reference that an engineer may not think about when they build these AI models. So I do think something like an AI ethicist is a job that didn't exist before. And maybe philosophy majors who before were perhaps not seen in the same way as STEM students, in the future, they might actually be part of this whole AI technology thing, not because they know how the AI works, but because they're thinking about the implications of the AI in the future, right? So I think these new roles, again, it's hard to predict what they are, but I think a lot of those new roles will require skills that are hard to automate, right? So my encouragement to a lot of people from a skill development perspective is think about what is the hard stuff to automate and become good at those things. So public speaking, content creation in terms of what you're doing, right? I think that is one big area. I think also trust building when you're thinking about selling. I still think fundamentally selling is still a very human thing, right? And to me, the underlying piece of that is trust, right? If people trust AI, then okay, fine, maybe that goes away. But I still think today many people don't fully trust it. If you have a human in the process, that's going to make things a lot easier as well. So I think from a skills perspective, we want to think about what is the hard to automate stuff and start to get good at that. But I think there's also one caveat that I want to provide as well, which is that as AI exponentially gets better, what is hard to automate today might also become easy to automate tomorrow, right? So the number one sort of recommendation I have is make sure that whatever you do, you embrace continuous learning, right? Because I think if you lose that muscle, then it becomes very hard to start to learn again. And the example I have from my own experience is when I was a banker. Um, I enjoyed the job, was kind of doing it, and was very focused on it. But when it came to studying for my GMAT exam, which is the exam you need to apply to business school, I realized that a lot of stuff that I was good at in high school, I became really bad at, right? So just like basic trigonometry, I'm like, I remember looking at the same question when I was, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, but right now it is not computing in my head. And I think a big reason for that is I just stopped that learning muscle. So whether it's, looking at an interesting podcast, whether it's going to an event about something new, I think all these things are really good to do from time to time just to keep that learning muscle going. So when a new AI tool drops in your industry or function, you're ready to embrace it. Because if you don't do that and a new tool or some new AI comes in, the immediate reaction is going to be fear, right? Whereas if it's continuous learning, it might be fear, but it's probably also a bit of excitement as well. And I think that's a nice combination, right? So I think if people embrace continuous learning, I think that's a really good way to prepare yourself potentially for what's coming.
And I've also seen a video where someone was talking about AI, and this was maybe a bit more of a positive twist
Mm.
on how AI was going to impact the future of work. Is so many people are scared that, oh, AI is going to take away the tedious tasks. It's going to, increase my output. So then now our team, instead of being 5 people, is going to scale down to 2 people because 2 people can do 5 people's worth of work. Um, but the argument was, well, but from a business perspective, if all of a sudden, you know that your productivity of your each individual person has doubled or tripled, wouldn't you want more of those people? So then your business can do more and grow faster.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit of a more positive spin on it instead of it's going to take away all of our jobs.
Yeah, sure. And I think to a certain extent, right, a lot of this is also, I think, going to depend on business model transformation, right? And the way I see it, it's not really about, okay, the AI is there, let's straight away use it. I think the right question for business leaders is going to be, how does our business model need to change? And then does AI enable that change, right? And the interesting thing I found is if you have business model transformation, AI is not always a silver bullet that's always going to deliver that, especially in sort of our region of the world. Where we are, the average unit cost of labor tends to be lower than, let's say, Europe or North America, just as an example. So sometimes when we do the consulting, we realize, you know what, it might just be better to hire three or four people rather than invest all this money in building a massive AI model, right? So I think it's important to be realistic about it, right? And keep some of those economics sort of points in mind as well.
And switching the gears a little bit too, how do you think AI can affect the future of creativity, and how can how AI is changing the differentiation for the brands? Because even before the explosion of the widely available AI tools, you could already see sort of your typical direct-to-consumer brand look,
Mhm.
because us as humans tend to gravitate towards certain things. So I'd say maybe about 5 years ago, you could just look at a brand and be like, oh, you are a young brand, you're a direct-to-consumer brand, you all have a certain look to yourselves. So now, with AI being able to generate infinite content, how do you think the brands can actually differentiate themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like we could do an entire hour just on that question itself, right? But maybe let me think about a concrete AI example that I'm seeing. So nowadays, quite a few brands have come to us and they've said, we've seen this theme of virtual influencers, right? And a lot of AI is underlying those virtual influencers. So I think that's a very interesting area because if I think about a brand and I think about what is the risk of, let's say, having a KOL or a celebrity kind of endorse it, it's that you are associated with the positive parts of that celebrity. You also then implicitly become associated with the negative parts, right? And we often see that at the beginning, the brand makes the association, things are rosy, and then that celebrity goes and does something crazy, and they get all the negative blowback there as well, right? But with a virtual influencer, what happens is the brand has full control, right? And if the brand has full control, they are not worried about the renewal, in the future. They're not worried about the virtual ambassador doing something nuts. They have absolute full control over everything. And I think with the virtual influencer, they can also shape it exactly how they want, which starts to get really interesting. So I've seen a few firms start to even think about giving their consumers one-on-one interaction with their virtual influencer, right? Which is pretty easy to do. If you have the virtual influencer, set up a chat group, whatever, or a chat room, and then the person can interact with them as well. So I think the virtual influencer idea, I think embodies a lot of values that the brands are trying to communicate with their end consumers. And so I think that is one very nice application of AI that brings together the AI, the content creation, but also embodies the brand values there as well. So, many different ways to do it, but I think the virtual ambassador, the virtual sort of influencer idea, is one very interesting one that's, I think, catching a lot of companies, not, I wouldn't say by surprise necessarily, but it's creating a lot of excitement there.
And what do you think in this staying on this particular example with the virtual influencers, to play devil's advocate?
Sure.
You would say that the reason people follow, influencers today is for the relatable experiences they go through. You see that, oh, I followed this girl since we were both in university, and then she got married, I got married, she had a child, I had a child, so you sort of develop that like emotional connection with them. Do you think that that sort of would change in the future? Do you think that us as consumers can still relate to the virtual influences and still get as influenced by a created, model as opposed to like a real human being?
Yeah. So, yeah, I appreciate you asking the question. And this is one of the benefits I find of doing the teaching. Because when I do the teaching, I teach the MBA level, the master's level, and the undergrad level. So it's basically a few different generations, right? And so recently in my undergrad class, we were talking about virtual influencers. And I remember asking the class, how many of you would trust a virtual influencer versus a real celebrity? And the example was, and I'm a big football fan, right? So I said, if Cristiano Ronaldo comes up with a shoe, right, a football shoe, and says, this is a fantastic shoe, and then a virtual influencer says, this is a fantastic shoe, how many of you take Ronaldo versus the virtual influencer, right? And at the undergrad level, the split was about 50-50, and I was shocked. I was shocked because, and maybe this is why I might be considered a dinosaur, right? But for me, it would be 100% Cristiano Ronaldo, 0% virtual influencer. And the rationale behind that is a virtual influencer has never played football, right? How do they know what's a good shoe? Whereas the celebrity person who has, let's say, domain expertise in that area, I am fully confident that they will be really good at what they do and therefore they know a good shoe, right? So for me, it's 100 and 0. So when I saw 50-50, I was A, shocked, but B, I also asked the students, why do you feel that way, right? Like, what's your rationale for it? And the interesting part that they said was, when I think of Cristiano Ronaldo, right? Okay, he's a star on a pedestal, but most likely I will never be like him. Okay. But this virtual influencer embodies values, culture, things I can relate to. So that is the piece that builds a trust. And so therefore, when the virtual influencer says this shoe is great, I am more inclined to believe them. Right. And so again, it's very different in terms of the way I think and the way they think. And I don't think one is wrong and one is right. It's just a reflection of changing times, changing technology, and just the way things are going, right? So, based on what I see in terms of their reaction, I think there is some traction there. I'm sure it's going to depend on brand, like a lot of other factors are going to matter. But I guess my initial impression where it was 100 and 0, I think it's definitely not going to be like that going forward. So I think if brands are smart about how they do it, potentially they might have a real winner on their hands there, based on what I see from the sort of younger members of our society.
Oh, it's very interesting because that's true, because they've grown up in a very different time to us, right? And it's fascinating because for me also it's like 100% I would buy from a human, but the fact that kids out there who are, I mean, it's silly calling them kids, right? Like they're like young adults,
Sure.
right?
Yep.
Like are thinking very differently. It really makes you think like, wow, what's actually going to happen when when my daughter is an adult? Like she's probably going to think, I'm not going to trust a human because a human can be bought.
Yeah.
And then, but, in an AI influencer, even though it's created by a human, maybe she can, tell me a bit more of an objective picture, but it's fascinating to think about it.
Yeah. And I think fundamentally it comes down to trust, right? And how do we facilitate or build that trust? And I think this is fundamentally going to be one of the challenges, I think, for brands going forward, right? Is how do they actually build that trust? Is it a question of authenticity? Is it a question of matching the values? And this is why I think AI is so fascinating, especially in the area of marketing, because we're now starting to deconstruct what is the human experience, right? And what are components of that? And I think before it was just given that humans are good with humans and it's going to be like that forever. And I think now we're starting to question some of those assumptions. So the designers of AI products are really thinking about that from a UI UX perspective. Like I even see some chatbot vendors, right? They're trying to get their chatbots to delay the response because people feel that if they get the information straight away, it's weird. Like, your normal chat experience, right?
Yeah.
Like you're talking to someone, Kevin is typing, right? And then there's a little bit of a delay between Kevin is typing and you getting it back. And so therefore, people feel that's a more human chat experience. Whereas if you get the response straight away, it's odd, and despite the idea that it's instant gratification. So the assumption with a lot of these AI products would have been instant gratification is good, right? But what you're finding is if you can mimic the human experience with some of these sort of interactions, the overall user satisfaction actually goes up, which is wild, right? So that's why I really think for a lot of the marketing applications, we really have to stop thinking about it from the pure what can the technology do and really think about what is the human values, the human experience that we're trying to create, and then how do we replicate that? And I think that in some ways starts to help build the trust going forward. And I think that's the fundamental currency that's really important in the future.
Oh, it's very interesting to dissect it sort of in this direction because if you think about it, like what really is it, right? It's the storytelling and it's the relatable experiences. But even if you look at things like reality TV, for example,
Mm.
it's like we watch reality TV for entertainment. We watch it because we relate to some of the people that are in it, and we see some of the stories unfold, and you sort of feel like you can learn and relate and feel connected. But how much of it is engineered, how
Mm.
much of it is scripted, how
Mhm.
much of it is actually acted out, saying, all right, so today you two get on set and you get into a fight because of that, and then we're going to film this whole thing. So
Mhm.
that it does make you question almost everything,
Mhm.
saying like, all right, those are humans acting in the reality TV, but how much of it is real versus if we have an AI reality TV show,
Mhm.
like how really different is it
Yeah.
ultimately from the scripting perspective? So yeah, it really makes you question yourself, makes you
Mhm.
wonder like, wow, where are we gonna actually go with this? Changing the topics up a little bit,
Sure.
on the myths and misconceptions, what are
Mm.
some of the biggest sort of misconceptions or AI advice that you hear that just drives you crazy?
Yeah, quite a bit out there, right? I think it comes back a little bit to this idea that AI is a silver bullet. It's going to come in, it's going to take away all our problems, and everything's going to be fine. And I really think that we should think of this as a tool, right? It's one of the many tools we have, but it's a powerful tool. And I think this idea where it's a silver bullet, it's going to save everybody, that is not the case, right? And if anything, like I said, there are certain situations where hiring people is definitely going to be better than the human and then the AI, right? So I think that's probably number one in terms of myths. I think number second myth that I think people should really start to get away from is this idea that AI is only usable by a few people who have high level of expertise. One of the things that I've been most excited about when we see all these tools is the general sort of spreading and democratization of AI overall. And a lot of these new tools are what we call low code and no code tools, meaning that they don't require programming, they don't require coding to be able to use them, right? And when I do a lot of workshops, so for example in Hong Kong, a lot of alumni from Wharton and INSEAD, the two of the schools that I went to, we often host workshops for the alum, and many of them come in, and their initial thought, especially folks who might be more senior, would be, "Yeah, this technology thing, it's too far or too above me, and there's no way I can use it." And what I find is when you show them these low code and no code tools, and you force them to use it, they realize how easy it is, right? And it's this myth of, oh, I need to be a coder or a programmer to be able to use AI. I think that's going out of the window, right? And it's already true now. And so therefore, if you really feel that way, my suggestion to a lot of people is just go out and try one or two tools. Right? You'll see how easy it is, and you will be surprised at how little programming or coding or computer knowledge you need to be able to use these things, right? So that is probably the second myth that I see that infuriates me, but not from a I'm angry at the tech, but I'm just sad that the potential opportunity people are missing out on is the problem there, right? So if you really are afraid, my biggest suggestion is just go out and give it a test spin, right? You give it a test drive, you'll see how easy it is. I think that will dispel a lot of it for you. So I think if we could just address those two things, I think a lot of more people would use it, and then I think we'd see a lot more people feeling comfortable with it.
And to end on a positive note,
Sure.
what are some of the surprising or delightful AI use cases that you have seen?
Mm. Um, okay, I could talk about this for an hour as well, right? But let me pick one or two that I'm really excited about. So number one, I think the innovations in healthcare is something that I'm very excited about. If I zoom in, because there's many, but if I zoom in, I'm really excited about the idea of preventative healthcare. So what I mean by that is right now the healthcare model is very reactive, meaning you get sick, you go to the hospital. right? And the hope in the future is that if the AI knows data about you, it can predict with very high accuracy what you might have in 5 or 10 years, right? And if we know what you might have in 5 or 10 years, you could potentially do things today that will, I wouldn't say eliminate the risk, but decrease substantially that risk of a heart attack, that risk of maybe cancer, that risk of something really bad happening, right? So I think if we can get this predictive healthcare thing right, I honestly believe we can expand life expectancy by at least 10, 15 years. Then we might have to think about what we're going to do in that time, which is a whole different problem, but a good problem to have, right? So I'm very excited about sort of the preventative medicine, preventive healthcare. That's a big one. And the second one that maybe I'm also kind of, quite excited about is the integration of a lot of these generative AI tools with robotics, right?
Mm.
Because I think that's something that people have not quite fully embraced the value of. So I think companies use robots in like warehouses, stuff like that. But if we think about, for example, old age care, right? Like right now, I think that a few of the large sort of World Health type of organizations, they've often cited loneliness as being one of the biggest problems we have, because that then leads to a lot of diseases and a lot of
Mm.
issues, down the line, both physical and mental as well. And we're seeing a lot of AI now potentially being applied in the area of companionship, right? So if we see, for example, robot pets, right? This is kind of a big one. And when I mention robot pets to a lot of people, especially for folks who have real life pets, they're like, "Oh, there's no way I would substitute Fluffy, my real dog, for this robot dog," right? But on the other hand, if we think about uh, populations where people are getting older, it's hard to take care of the pets. It's hard to, look after them, right? And I think if you have this robot that becomes a companion, I think for a lot of people, it solves a loneliness problem. And I think one of the arguments that people make is, well, you're never going to form a real emotional bond, right? But when we look at countries like Japan, where they have a lot of older people, we actually see that when folks have these robot pets and when they quote unquote, break or the batteries die or whatever, they actually have like robot pet burials and people are really emotionally attached to these things. So I think from a companionship perspective, the integration with large language models and robots is going to be very interesting. And I think also in the area of old age care, because nowadays I think it's really hard to find people to do those jobs, which is, maybe cleaning up after an old person or helping them from a mobility standpoint. Whereas if, let's say, you have this robot that can help you with those things and also be the companion, then for many countries that are going to experience this population shift to more older people, I think that is also another very exciting use case. I also know when people talk about AI and companionship, people think of the movie Her, right, which is pretty scary. I think in terms of the future that they portrayed. So I think we need to be careful with this, right? Again, over reliance, a lot of things we've talked about. We need to be mindful of that. So I'm not saying the Her thing isn't going to happen, but I think we need to take care as to how we do this human interaction and use the AI, the robots for certain scenarios and cases, and also keep the human interaction piece there. But that's a area where I'm also scared and excited at the same time too.
Very interesting. And where can listeners follow your work and connect with you?
Sure. So happy to connect with folks over LinkedIn. That's probably where we show a lot of the research we're working on, the tools we're working on. We've also got our website, bluedigital.ai, where they can see a lot of our like forefront research that we're producing as well. And I think those would probably be the two main areas. Again, I'm more than happy to have conversations, coffees with people. I really enjoy the topic. We at Blue enjoy being educators about it as well. So if people have questions, concerns, fears, if you're going to jump, we'll talk you off the ledge, hopefully. But yeah, definitely engage with people about this, because if you're scared about it, talking, sharing, and educating yourself, I think is one of the best ways to address that.
Sounds good. I think it was a very rich episode. Thank you so much for coming, Kevin. It was great having you on the podcast. Thank
Fantastic.
you.
Thank you for having me.